the economics of science and technology policy because it speaks to my soul. The idea that many of the problems that we have can be solved in certain ways by technological advance and like addressing sort of many of the missions that the federal agencies have. So like HHS, DOE, things like that, solve a lot of problems through science development.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. When federal researchers work with private industry to turn a technology into a product, that process creates revenue, jobs, even new industries. Those numbers tell a story about the impact and outcomes of tech transfer. Today, we get some of that story from Michael Hall, an economist in the Technology Partnerships Office at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. In his role, Michael helps translate data into insights that show just how much tech transfer contributes to innovation, jobs, and economic growth. His work sheds light on why this process is so important, not just for the scientists and entrepreneurs, but for everyone. A quick note, this interview was recorded in May 2024, so some details may be outdated. Now, let's get to it. Could you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into your role and into tech transfer at all?
Yeah, so I am an economist. I got my PhD from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I have always been interested in like science and tech policy or science and technology in general. And then in school, studying economics, like the economics of science and technology policy, because it speaks to my soul. And I really like science and technology policy. I really like the economics around it, like Kenneth Arrow's like economic growth models. The idea that many of the problems that we have can be solved in certain ways by technological advance and like addressing sort of many of the missions that the federal agencies have. So like HHS, DOE, things like that, solve a lot of problems through science development. And being able to facilitate that and work on that. And I also love the math and statistics associated with the economics. So it's the combination of those two things. In addition to that, I love economic development. So EcoDevo. And after grad school, I went to Central Michigan University for a year, and then I went to the University of Kansas, and I worked there with a lot of state of Kansas economic development folks with their Department of Commerce and their Department of Labor and Department of Ed to answer questions for them. And then I got a call from NIST asking if I was interested in working on doing economics for federal government associated with the tech transfer policy and things like that. So it aligns really well with my personal interests. I enjoy the job and it's a lot of fun. So the elevator speech that I give people is, the federal government spends about $200 billion a year on research and development across the federal research institutes. And in part of that process of like doing science, we come up with cool technologies. So you can think of examples like GPS technology or communications technology or all sorts of things that we do. And there are a series of laws associated with get these things out into the use by the American public. The process by which that happens is our technology transfer. And as an economist, I do a couple things in this space. One, and by statute, we communicate to various stakeholders, particularly Congress and White House, the activities that are associated with this and what we're doing in this space. So those are the federal technology transfer reports. In addition to that, we do work on the interagency side of looking at how does this process play out? And as an economist and like a trained researcher, it's asking and answering interesting questions is what we do. And we try to answer those questions both for NIST and then broadly for the interagency community. So we get various agencies that ask us questions about the tech transfer process or things associated with like the operations of ORDAs. So we answer those questions for people. So the biggest part and the part that pays the bills is the federal technology transfer reports and collecting the data from all the agencies and communicating to White House and Congress the activities and trying to communicate the value of all the things that we do to some of our most important stakeholders for a variety of reasons. Their importance is there. And that is the crux of the job. Beyond that, it's facilitate and help the interagency community understand sort of the process. And to the extent that we're able to provide information and insight that's valuable to help them do better at their own jobs. So that's what we spend our time doing. And then there's a variety of other things that we do, but I enjoy the process. So it's lots of fun.
Could you tell me about how that asking and answering questions plays out?
So the best example I can give is in 2016, NIST did a survey of the ORDAs from across the federal government to ask questions about their organizational and operational characteristics. How many employees do you have? Where are certain decisions made within sort of the structure of how you do tech transfer? And there have been a number of agencies who have asked us questions about the information that we receive from that survey. So we try very hard to be good stewards of the data that we receive from agencies. We don't name names. We don't do anything like that. But we try to provide insight into how many FTEs per scientific staff are at different organizations, because this varies wildly. And some people are interested in, well, how do we compare against other organizations? And comparisons aren't super great because there's lots of caveats and missions and things like that. But those are the kinds of questions that we try to answer. And I think that's probably the most directly applicable example of agency reaches out, we put it together, and we sort of like give it to them. A lot of this is very much not published in a normal sort of like tech transfer report kind of thing, but here's the information that we have and the insights that would be available to use so that they can go to senior leadership and communicate to them, this is what we're doing. To some extent, we are thinking about how we can improve our capabilities of doing that and having conversations about, well, can we have another survey like this and make it better to collect better data? And I think that's one of the limitations that we run into is the amount of data that are available to us to use. I can use the NIST internal data to do analyses. So we have a publication that looks at the licensing success rate, to use the term that our friends from Navy Medical Research Development used in their paper. But looking at sort of the proportions of our invention disclosures that we've patent on or file patents on, and then sort of the things that we file patents on, like how many of those get licensed, and sort of looking at that as an example of how aggressively do we patent, how successful are we at licensing as a proof of concept that other agencies might consider as something they might look at for their data and saying, well, how do we compare against these? Because there are examples of this across sort of the university systems, and Autumn has done stuff like this. So that's a good secondary example of the kind of things that we do. That's more sort of research, asking questions and things like that.
And you touched on this as you were talking about the data, but have you run into any challenges or come up with any ways of handling such vast amounts and diversity of data and organizing it and making sense of it as part of your job? But
yeah, so that's data is one of the biggest challenges that we face. Oftentimes the issue is we don't have enough data, or we don't have the data that we would like, because the information that I want is more granular and more finely sort of grained than the data that is available. Because internal to our own data sets, I can see all of the information associated with our invention disclosures and things like that. I only get aggregated information from other agencies, which is very reasonable. And there's lots of reasons why we would not share that information, but it limits the analyses that we can do. So the biggest issue for data is actually there's not enough of it. And as an economist, I want all of the data. The rules on who has the authority to ask for and to share the data are reasonably limiting. It's part of the being in the federal government. But thankfully, we have, over the last couple of years, developed good working relationships with a lot of the agencies in the interagency tech transfer community, and developing partnerships and the ability to ask questions. So not only do we receive questions from people, I can reach out to some agencies and say, hey, I have seen you've run this program. I am interested in data associated with this. Can you share this with us? And partners have been very willing and able to share with us appropriately de-identified, aggregated data. So we're not able to look at the fine-grained stuff, but we can do some of the analyses that we would like to do and answer some of the questions that we're interested in answering. Because at the end of the day, the data are a tool to answer a question for a particular audience or stakeholder. Oftentimes, that audience or stakeholder is one of the agencies. Sometimes it's Congress. So it really depends on what we're doing, but that's the whole process.
So is it fair to say that when you're looking for more data, it's like you have maybe a team's record for the season, but you don't have the information on how the individual players performed or how the plays played out, things like that?
Yeah, very, very much that. We can look at, the final scores, but we're not looking at, individual performance on individual plays or anything like that. So we get aggregated data, the total number of invention disclosures in a particular year, or the total dollar amount of income received from licensing revenues and things like that. So there are some limitations. There are some difficulties because some of the analyses we'd like to do involve sort of tracking individual invention disclosures over their life cycle. But if we can't see this individual invention disclosure from the start to the finish and understanding sort of the process, the timeline, and things like that, for all of the invention disclosures, then we can't really do some of the things that we want to do at that level. So that's where the proof of concept using the NIST data comes into play. So we can publish here's what we did, and maybe medical research and development did a very similar sort of thing. So you have two data points you can compare your agency to if you would like to do that. So we're just limited in some ways, but we do our best to execute the mission to the best of our ability, given the limitations we face. And I think we do a reasonable job most of the time. We can always answer a question. Sometimes the answer to that question is, I don't know.
And I would love to talk a little bit about the summary reports that NIST puts out. And when you came into your position, please correct me if I'm wrong, there was a bit of a backlog on these summary reports, and you managed to not only catch up on them, but implement more efficient ways to catch up on them. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I forget the last report that we had published at the time that became my responsibility, but we were several years behind, and we had a backlog of the data from what agencies had given us. And there were a couple issues associated with the way that it was being processed. Most of the issue was for reasons related to how the clearance and review process for interagency reports to Congress go. We were operating in a world where we did these in a series. So we would put a report together, we would run it through the clearance and review process. It would take a certain number of months, 6 or so, give or take. And then we would get that done, and then we would start in on the next one. And that took some time. Once I took over, we adjusted how we operate in that space, in that we went from running everything in a serial sort of setup to a parallel setup where as soon as one report was finished and entered into the review process, I would start the next one right away and go through that process because I had several years of data that I could work with. That was the biggest issue. That required a couple changes in how we operate and how the reports go together. So if you look at the report starting in like 2017, there's a footnote in one of the first pages that say the data in this report are up to date as of X date. So there's a timestamp on the data. And that meant that by doing that, we could have multiple reports in the process. And if there was a conflict with, well, here's what the data say in this report, in 2017 relative to 2018, we could point to that and say, it is based off the data at this time when it was entered into review. We can update as necessary, but we didn't have to deal with the conflict in data, which was a big issue. And that's the solution that we came up with there. The other issue that we ran into, or we were trying to avoid by running it in serial, is having multiple reports in review sent out to the agencies at the same time. So the review process includes sending the report to OMB, who then shares it across all the affected agencies, and they provide comments and send them back and things like that. And the standard operating procedure before was do one at a time because we don't want these multiples of these on people's desks because then you get conflicting comments and feedback and things like that. We decided that that's not that big of an issue for purposes of catching up. So if we just do that and deal with the hassle that might create for effectively a year while we run through like 4 reports or something, then we'll get caught up and then we don't have to do that again. So now we are at the point where we are up to date. The most recent one that I have full data for is effectively finished, and we're going to start in the clearance and review process as soon as I get the last of a couple sections updated and things like that. So it shouldn't take very long. And then I am no longer the rate limiting factor again. So it's fun. The final solution or the final piece that goes into that is just lots of brute force and ignorance. I spent many hours with many pots of coffee just grinding through hundreds of pages of charts and figures and tables. We now are in a space where we only have to do them once a year. I am very appreciative of all of the legislative affairs staff who handle the review and clearance process, because not only is it like me spending hours going through all these things, but they have to handle me sending them a document. They send it off to the people to get reviewed. They get it back. So they were wonderful to work with, but now I only have to talk to them like once a year. So it's awesome.
As wonderful as they are, it's better off to...
It's better for them. The tech transfer reports are the part of the job that pay the bills. They're not necessarily the fun parts, but asking or answering questions for people and the outsized role that we have in the ability to make a difference in certain places is wonderful. So I love it.
And is there anything that you wish more people knew about you, either what you do or your office?
Our ability to answer questions and be a resource for folks, I think, is one of the things that I enjoy. And to the extent that we're able to do that for more people, because the best parts of my job, well, I have a lot of great parts of my job, but one of the fun things is when an agency asks me a question and I'm like, I have the information to answer that question for you. So I can put something together and say, here's a response. Here's my best approach to answering this question for you. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are, here's 5 pages of caveats as to why the confidence bands on this number are massive. But to the extent that we're able to be helpful and useful to all the people who are doing the important things that they're doing. So if people know about that and they can ask me questions, I am happy to help.
So if you're listening and you have questions, please, Michael is waiting for your questions and excited to answer them.
I would also like any data you're able to share. That is useful too.
I think that that's an excellent note to end. So Michael Hall, thank you again so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in for this conversation and spreading the word about this podcast. Tell your friends and colleagues about the podcast and leave us a review and rating because that helps other people find us. Subscribe and listen to more episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Check the show notes or the episode page at federallabs.org for links to more resources and information that came up in our conversation. Thanks, as always, to our producer and digital marketing manager, Carly Dunow, graphics manager, Danny Batchelor, web content and systems manager, Jess Klein, and the FLC staff and community for your support. We'll see you back in 2 weeks on Transfer Files Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.